No, 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 it's not that. And then let's talk many things. So that is distracted from what has caused the trouble in here. So that's where I'm looking at. That's what happened? Yes. Five people like him. You guys remove the next one. It would be nice to have another Lagos university. But the logistics and infrastructure of people university. I'm thinking, you know, my university is not also let's hold on. It's not 5:30 yet, so that we are not accused of. Let's just.
It's like when you go to all these competitions and it will help to support the institution. Usually, you have to make competitions and
yeah, it's been doing a lot of that.
Let me start.
I can't see them. How many people do we have online?
We have
Okay, so please let me see their names so that I will know if those are our presenters. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Let me see the other attendees. Let me see the other attendees. Okay, just one. Oh, okay, yeah. She's the only one now.
Hello.
Okay, so where is it going again? We are starting now. Okay, so I think we can get started now. Okay, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to this panel, Decoloniality in Transition, Part 4. My name is Adeolu Oyekon, Lagos State University. We have 5 presenters. I would like to know if all our presenters are here. So we have our first presenter, Arugo Akpome from the University of Zululand. I think he's here and is set. I would like to know if Kosim Aliu is here too. Okay. Omolola Olarinde is joining us virtually. Okay. Nathaniel Umilani. Nathaniel Umilani is not here. And then we have Ifeoma Catherine Ongudufo. Also, since she's not here yet. Okay, so we are going to have how many minutes are we been having? 15 minutes of presentation. Starting with Arugo Akpome of the University of Zululand. He will be talking on decolonizing the westernized university institution, African thought, scholarship, and prizes. You are most welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, colleagues. Thank you for the time. When I was doing my master's, I started attending conferences because my surname started with A, and in South Africa, many surnames do not start with vowels. I always appeared at the top of the list, but I always presented at the end of the conference like this. So this is back to those days, but it's okay. This paper, you can share it for me now. Yeah. This paper is actually not a personal paper. It's coming from a group of scholars at my university. We are currently doing a project. The university is in the middle of a project of trying to, if I can borrow the words of that our commentator Baba who spoke in the last session, to identify inauthenticity and to introduce, to promote authenticity, especially in regard to scholarship in an African university. That's our project. And I intend to present some of what we are doing, and I'll be glad to get your comments and your feedback. So it's work in progress. It's definitely work in progress. I'm fortunate to be one of the colleagues working with, we contributed to the formulation of my institution's 5-year strategic goal, 2022 to 2027, where the university rebranded itself. It used to have the slogan, restructured for relevance. But since last year, it now has the slogan, a node for African thought. I think it's also riding on the wave of the decolonial turn, but from the vibes we get, the indications we get from senior leadership, and I'm talking about the Vice Chancellor, there seems to be serious commitment to both theorize and put into practice ideas and strategies that would move our institution, we hope, from being just one institution in Africa to be, if I can borrow that term, it's a difficult term, an authentic African university. So this presentation is situated in that context. I'm reporting on what we've started doing. This particular paper was put together by me, Morgan Ndlovu, Nelson Ratau, and Clasper Moniela. 4 of us ought to be here to do a panel, but for some reasons, the other colleagues couldn't make it. So this is the abstract. That the modern university institution is no longer enjoys the status of being a paragon of virtue in Africa and elsewhere in the world is no longer contested. What remains debatable is what it will take to restore the legitimacy of this important institution in Africa. Using the idea of African thought, an innovative approach developed at the University of Zululand, so it was meant to be a panel. I want to explore ways in which African universities can privilege epistemologies of the global South and indigenous African knowledges. I want to explore how decolonial, post-colonial, and Afrocentric grammars and vocabularies of change might be blended in ways that are non-fundamentalist, non-nativist, and non-fadist. Let me just pause here because this is very crucial to our conceptualization of decolonization that we are doing now. Yes, the whole idea of decolonization, it seems to be a fad. And you have to agree when you go to some conferences of decolonization, such as this one. I've not been to many conferences, so I'm not making that in regard to this. But certain conferences, you just see the word decolonization thrown into the title, thrown into the abstract, doesn't really make sense. You don't really see how that debate is contributing to decolonization. I've seen that. I'm not saying that in any paper I've seen in this conference. So we are conscious of that. And we are trying to say we don't want to be faddists. We don't want to follow the flow. We don't want to get with the program. We want to be original in what we are doing, at least in the area of theorizing what we are doing. And we also we are also not fundamentalist. Our view of Eurocentric knowledges is that they are fundamentalist in the main, especially the areas of Eurocentric, Euromodernist epistemology that defines non-Europeans in very, very opposite and inferior ways. That is a fundamentalist approach to knowledge production to epistemology, which we do not seek to replicate. So we are not reversing it. We are not saying, oh, they said we were inferior and they were superior. No, now we want to assert that we are superior and they are inferior. That's not what we are doing. We are also not nativists. We are not saying that the native African, the Black person, maybe the Yoruba, the Hausa, the Yoruba, the Swahili, is some kind of essential, authentic being that stands apart from every other being in the world. No, that's not the point. So we think of African as the experiences, the ontologies. So we think of Africa in very pluralistic terms. That's what we are trying to develop. So that's why we are seeking to blend these different grammars and ideas. So we propose the instrumentalization of African thought, which we argue is inherently polyvocal, that is, it includes many voices, is reflexive. It doesn't make assertions. We don't seek to make assertions that we cannot reflect upon. That we don't seek to be recalcitrant. We seek to say, okay, we can be experimental and we can find out if we are not right or if we are going wrong or if we are not complete. So we are very conscious of that. And it's also what is reflexive, responsive, and dynamic, and which relies on an ecology of pluralistic perspectives and ontologies across space and time. So we are open to going backwards and we are open to include ideas that are not necessarily native to Africa. So we examine the need for African universities to affirm and reinvent their identities as African universities rather than as universities in Africa by embracing African epistemologies as well as those of the global South. So we are also very sensitive to the global South as part and parcel of their geopolitics of knowledge. If I have chance, I'll talk about the geopolitics of knowledge. We ask furthermore how semi-rural African universities, now this is specific to us, we are based in a village. Our main campus is in the village of Kwadlangezwa in KwaZulu-Natal, about 2 hours from Durban. But we do have a campus in a city, a nearby city called Richards Bay. But the main campus, so we see ourselves as a rural university. How can we take advantage of the indigenous epistemologies, ontologies, and socioeconomic realities of their immediate communities to tap into the knowledges otherwise? When we speak of knowledges otherwise, we are talking about knowledges that are outside the mainstream, largely Eurocentric epistemologies. And my colleague Lobo has this very interesting idea that when we speak of the epistemicides that occurred on the back of colonization, for instance, the destruction of indigenous knowledge production systems in many parts of the world, the people in Africa, Lobo argues, and I agree with him, since they retain largely their languages, many of them still retain their languages. The languages serve as a point of entry into the knowledges, to residues of knowledge. And that's something the Africans that were taken into the diaspora lost, for example, over their decades of being there. So we are thinking, how is it possible for a university in Africa to tap into that? So we know we are losing culture. Many African cultures complain we're losing the language, but we still have residues. So our argument is, in these residues, we might be able to find something that can still benefit us. So it's not all lost. But how do we tap into those residues? How do we take advantage of that? And we also think that as a rural university, we may have an edge over a university like the University of Lagos. Universities are cited in very urban centers, because here there's too much of the global dominant Eurocentric ideas, and that might compromise the ability of these universities, these very big metropolitan universities, to focus on the residual indigenous knowledge. How would this enable the harnessing of, among other things, long-standing knowledge and spiritual practices? Let me now skip quickly. And how many more minutes do I have, Chair?
You have
6. Okay, let me see what I can do in 6. Let me try to, how do we define coloniality? I see that that's been an issue. It ought not to be an issue, but I think it's an issue. My view is there is a deliberate pushback by some scholars, like you have Femi Taiwo's against decolonization. there's a deliberate pushback, and I think it's from those seated in the middle of Eurocentric knowledge production. They see, in my view, the decolonial turn as a challenge. And there's a deliberate pushback to make it, let me borrow Peter Osimiri's term, a debased currency. To make it mean everything, and by so doing, mean nothing. So we'd like to reemphasize, let me not talk of colonization, let me talk about coloniality. We think we have a shorthand, our popular, our famous, or our preferable shorthand, our preferable metaphor for coloniality is the vertical world. And I think that's what the chair of the last session was talking about when he talked about horizontal conflict. It's a vertical world. On the one side of the world, interestingly, we have the global north, right? And then we have the global south. It kind of captures it metaphorically. On the one side are those who enjoy Euromodernist modernity. People for whom Euromodernist modernity means more life, more food, more resources, more decent living. On the other side, there are those at the bottom who are victims, if you like, of Euromodernism. So we see coloniality as the expression, we see that as the expression of coloniality. We see it as a world, a global system, and Peter made reference to this when he says that dominant Euromodernist knowledges are skewed against the so-called developing world. So we are interested, our goal for decolonization is to make the world, is to produce knowledge, to promote knowledge that will flatten the world as much as possible. We do not assume we are going to accomplish, we are not God. But we think of decolonization as increasing the life chances of people who have been at the receiving end of the dominant, hegemonic, economic, social, cultural practices of Euro-modernist realities, of contemporary Euro-modernist life. So that is our goal by promoting knowledges. We believe that there is no neutral knowledge. There is no knowledge that is entirely objective. Many of us have been socialized into thinking, you know, especially those who work in the social sciences, and they say the researcher consulted. They never say I, say the researcher. Project yourself as some neutral person who has no bias. You know, that doesn't happen. Every knowledge is biased. Knowledge is produced to advance certain cultural, social, economic, political goals, either to inaugurate them or to sustain them or to move them further. So we are interested in producing knowledge that will both promote a flatter world, but that will increase the life chances, the economic chances, the political chances, the social chances of African people. So that is the goal that we have. That is not discriminatory. We also hold the view that the current Euromodernist, the dominant Euromodernist, how many more minutes? 3, 2. The dominant Euromodernist knowledges contribute strongly to violently discriminatory social, economic, and political orders. It sustains. We believe that the reality you see is produced by knowledge, is produced by theory. Take the idea of entrepreneurship, which is very common. I'll stop on this one in many of our institutions. The concept of entrepreneurship as we have it, the dominant concept of entrepreneurship as we have it today, is the concept that unitizes the human, that reduces the human to metrics, that makes the human dispensable. And it's an idea, if we want to think of government, if we want to think of economics, we must come up with a new idea of what a new definition of what economic relations would be. Okay, finally, will you let me 1 more minute? What we are trying to do right now at our university is we are trying to do, we are interested in curriculum reform, pedagogical reform. What do you teach? Do you still teach? I, for one, I grew up in South in Delta State. And as many of you might know, the River Niger has its source at a place called Umutu, not too far from where we come from. But we were told that the River Niger was discovered by Mungo Park. That's what I was taught. And I was gobsmacked when my son, who is 22, told me that he was also taught that in school. So what do we teach as an African university? Do we still teach those things? What theories do we use? And that's where I was quarreling with one of our presenters in the past panel. Are we hung up on theories that define the world in certain ways, that demean us, that demean a certain section of the world, that blocks access, epistemological access, economic access to a certain part of the world while favoring another part of the world? We think we need to consider those things. So right now at the university, we are looking at curriculum transformation. We're encouraging the colleagues in different departments to examine their curriculum and see what needs to be changed. Then we're also doing surveys to get what the colleagues think. We are still in that process. What do they think? What would they like to do? And what can we do? How do we walk the talk? How do we identify what is inauthentic, to borrow your words again, sir, and promote that which is authentic? Because we see in this world, we are dependent. One definition of coloniality that we have is a life of dependence. You depend on the global north for content. You depend for theory. You depend for technology. You depend for loans. You depend for advice. You depend for everything. It's not sustainable. So we are looking at how to change those dynamics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I believe we will have questions and comments at the end. For now, how many of our presenters do we have online? Okay, so we will go to our presenter online as Omolola Oladeyinde from Elizabeth University. So she will be presenting on Beyond Assumed Positions, Reflexivity and Positionality by Women Researchers on Migration and Inclusive Growth in Africa. You have 15 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Fantastic. So I'm Omolola Olarinde.
Sorry, Olarinde, sorry. Yeah, please go ahead.
Great. And with a group of other researchers, we are presenting this piece, which is a result of a project that we worked on, Migration for Inclusive African Growth. And we're presenting this piece, which is a reflexivity piece on what the project was about and how we should approach migration research reflexively. So we are trying to enter this conversation. I can see that the previous speaker referred to this quite a bit, about how knowledge is created and whether it's positivist or constructivist, and whether we can rely on that knowledge using those theories and rely on objectivity entirely. And we entered this conversation from a reflexive angle because we really wanted to understand what it meant to create new knowledge in a different sphere that we were not part of what we brought up, not part of the scholarship in which we were brought up, to think about things reflexively. We thought about the content of what we were doing, the categories that we were examining, and we thought about how research is conducted globally, but specifically how that happens in Africa, and whether there's how African scholars are able to contribute to this knowledge creation sphere. And besides that, what kind of, we have a policy, our project has a strong policy dimension. So we thought about how migration research is practiced and the implications of that on the people who we're researching. So this is something that's been engaged in quite widely by global North scholars, I mean reflexivity, but just exceptions from global South scholars. We've mentioned one of them, Alfred and Ampofo, and we thought that it was quite important for us to enter into this sphere particularly because there was very little being done on migration scholarship from African researchers from the reflective perspective. And we thought we had quite something to contribute in terms of trying to think about knowledge outside the boxes that we had learned earlier. So there is a self, as you can see from Wuga, immersed in the knowledge creation process. So the self and the researcher is not diverse from the knowledge creation process. And one of the steps of engaging in this reflexive approach is to understand how the researcher is part, and also how the participants interacting one with the other are part of this knowledge creation. So of course, it's not a situation in which one party knows everything and is transmitting it to the other, but some co-creation of knowledge between researchers and the subjects that they're researching. So we really need to question the kind that we had, and that's what activity entails, to question, for example, assumptions that we have about certain groups, to question even our own objectivity in the research process. And then we needed to take an epistemological, methodological, and ethical stance. And by that, when we question these assumed positions that already exist in the literature, what exactly is the new knowledge that we're bringing on ground? When we question them, what processes are we going to go through to come to new knowledge, which is what we're trying to contribute, and what exactly does that mean from ethical perspectives, from do no harm perspectives? Now, the first step, of course, as I said earlier on, is to recognize that we all have positions. I mean, those are defined by certain characteristics. We're going to talk about that in another slide, but essentially background characteristics and how those interact with the research process. And that's how reflexivity approaches work to help to create new knowledge. So one of the things that engaging in this reflexivity helped us to examine was our role as researchers and how we come into research projects, particularly when we have to collect data for global audiences from the African perspective. And we questioned the assumption that we were insiders and perhaps even gatekeepers of, standing between Northern researchers and the people that we wanted to know about. But the literature is quite clear that, and our experience shows the same thing, that there's a lot of reliance on African scholars to pick up information and share that information about the subjects in that they're studying, that people want to be, that are concerned about. And this particularly so for migration studies, although there's a lot going on because migration essentially entails crossing borders. You can always study them and at either end of the borders. You can study them at source or destination. But when we want to look at some peculiar aspects of migration studies, for example, looking at drivers of migration, it's often done at the source and rely on African researchers to do this. But also some of that relies on the idea that we know how to reach these groups and that we're inside into this group. And we wanted to question the assumptions about what role we play exactly in this research process as African scholars. So as this is a decolonization piece, what we think is contributing to this theme is our search to place ourselves in the knowledge creation sphere. And this really has to do with, we're not questioning any of the hegemonic positions that the previous speaker spoke about, but we're trying to think about how to insert ourselves into the sphere. But of course, it takes some questioning of the existent epistemologies. So what we do then is to say, are these assumed positions? Are these assumed theories? Are these assumptions about how things work? Do they remain valid? And how do we really perceive them as Global South scholars? And what we want to do is to do that through interrogating those theories and methodologies and ethics of research. So we're going to share a bit about how this happened for us. So there's one global scholar among our authors, a global scholar among our authors, and she prompted the reflexivity work because many African scholars are either not aware of this approach or are not encouraged to use it because it's not part of the orthodox mainstream research methods. And so we were prompted to try this method as a new way of exploring knowledge creation on migration. And so we then started off by examining how we defined ourselves, our positionality. And you can see some characteristics there of us. We're all PhD holders. Well, at least 3 out of 4 of us were PhD holders. We're scientists, we're women researchers, we're all working in migration, we're all at intersections with gender, we're all middle class, and we had similar connections in that regard. But we were also different in many ways. We're different from the disciplinary perspective because it was an interdisciplinary team. And we were also different from, when that happens, when you're different from disciplinary perspectives, there are differences in how we approach research. For example, I am in economics, and we're very number-based field. We're very interested in measuring and quantitatives. Another one of us was in policy making, and they're more interested in that. So we thought about these differences and how they could contribute to the project itself. And so on this slide, I talk about how we then transform and become more reflexive. So in this whole realization, we came to know that we were very keen, as the previous speaker had said, on this language of objectivity. We had to be unbiased, neutral, not immerse ourselves in the process, be detached, all of the things that we're all familiar with, from getting our training in Africa. And of course, having to practice this was quite difficult to think, to speak. For example, the entire paper is written in the language of I and we, and to even speak in this way was difficult. So we found it very difficult not to move away from this positivist stance and to adopt this constructivist stance. But once we were able to do that, to get past this, after a couple of meetings in which we asked ourselves some questions about our project, and those questions were deep questions that made us think critically about, a little more critically than we'd done before, about what exactly we were doing. That helped us to overturn our assumptions regarding how objective we are. And I quote one of us there. She says she felt like a coin with 2 sides contributing to the past that silenced as a research. So normally as researchers, we talk as if we're presenting somebody else's position and we're out of the picture. And now this process asked us to speak up as researchers. For us, there are many ways through which you can do reflexivity. You can design a project with a reflexive approach, but for us, we did it as what we call post hoc. And what we did is we already finished the project, and then we approached it as a form of, we used reflexivity as a form of quality control. So we then, what we tried to do was to see what new knowledge we can create once we're able to think reflexively about our project. And I've said quite a bit about critiquing the assumptions that we have, also critiquing assumptions about.
You have 2 more minutes. You have 2 more minutes.
Thank you. I'll try to wrap up. And what we did was to pull out our field notes and try to think analytically about how our positions, as I defined earlier, interacted with the research. We used something called duoethnography because we were multiple researchers, and that helped us to have the intensive dialogue about our own experiences. It's different. It's different from ethnography itself because it's autobiographic in its own stance. I've spoken about the questions. So what exactly, and this is my last slide really, what exactly did we find out? One of the things we realized is that even without taking a stance of neutrality from the start, by the time we thought about it in hindsight, we realized that our positionality and those background attributes that we had, they impacted on various dimensions of our research. For example, on how we designed our research questions and what research interests we had. We were already immersed in the migration scholarship, and so we already knew, we already chose some parts of research objectives that reflected on that immersion. It also influenced our participant selection. So we tended to select participants that more closely. We also noticed that we were on this continuum of insider-outsider. We had examples from among ourselves. One of our researchers was a teacher. She is a teacher, and she is also the research also required her to interview policymakers, and so the tables were turned, and it was a totally different scenario for her in that case. So while we may think a lot about how we can be insiders, we also have to understand that there's an entire spectrum, and we identified ourselves as in-betweeners on this spectrum. We had similar positionalities when it came to cultural and theoretical understandings, and how we perceived culture affected African women. And we began to wonder about our subjects of study and how they were different because they were from a different position. They were from the informal sector, and they had different opportunities than we had. And we had to think about that. We also noticed, for example, that there was a lot of focus on, we're in migration scholarship, so there's a lot of focus on emigration because we're net sending countries. That should read net sending. But there was less focus on immigration, and that our own study was particularly addressing this. So we noticed that there were lots of policies as if African policies addressed migration as a whole and emigration. But when we looked at the statistics, there was more emphasis on the emigration part. And then we thought about how migration within and from Africa, I'm rounding up in a minute, could be thought of in negative terms, and that could immobilize Africans, and that we needed to think a lot more about terminologies. So thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Okay, so we've had two presentations. It will seem like our other presenters didn't make it. Or do we have any one of them in the audience? None? Nobody online as well? Okay, so I guess we will have sufficient time to ask questions and interact. So if I am allowed to make a few comments and ask some questions, I will proceed as follows. Okay, so to our first presenter, the opening sentence has something to do with universities globally no longer being paragons of virtue, if I got you right. And then you proceeded to say that you are thinking about how to remedy that, specifically within an African context. So the two immediate questions that come to my mind are this. Are you proceeding from the theoretical assumption that what you're trying to do what you are trying to come up with is incapable of addressing the questions, the issues that affect universities globally? Why do you restrict yourself to solving the problem of university education in Africa alone? Two, if you feel that the problem is that our universities are no longer paragons of virtue, to what extent do you think you can remedy this perceived problem through African epistemologies? I would have thought, for instance, that if the issue is the issue of virtue, although I would also want you to, expatiate on what you mean by that. I will want to understand the nexus between the virtue problem and the solution, which is now a resort to epistemologies. Okay, so moving from that, I will also like to ask, if we're talking about African epistemologies, are we operating under the assumption that African epistemologies are multiple yet very similar, such that we do not need to filter contradictions that may inhibit the project? So those are my questions. For Omolola, she said that the approach of our team does not attempt to displace existing theories or approaches. They are trying to insert themselves into the conversation. And so my question is, can we refer to this approach as decolonial? Or should we rather say that it's an exercise in cross-cultural knowledge production? I will want her to shed more light on what makes the effort decolonial if displacement is not part of the agenda. Yes, I also agree with her that Nigeria is a net immigration country. So many people are moving out these days, but I believe that in some specific areas, we also have people moving into Nigeria, especially if you go to the northern part. Many of our border settlements in the north, in the south, and also in the west here. So I will like to know those areas in which researches are being conducted and what efforts are being made to try and balance things a little bit by ensuring that the experiences of people who also come into Nigeria are captured. But before we begin to answer the questions, I've just been told that one of our presenters has joined us. So please, Ifeoma will have 12 minutes to talk to us on our paper. Our presentation is Decoloniality and the Reconstruction of the Femininity of the African Woman. Says slavery in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Devil on the Cross and Julioka Donnelly's Murky Waters. Please, Ifeoma, you have the floor, and you are very much welcome.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello.
Good evening.
Good evening.
To this esteemed, good evening to this panel. Ifeoma Catherine Ongbufo from Kwara University, Wukari, Taraba State. For the purpose of the management of this little time that I'm given to talk about two literary texts, I will try to be as fast as possible. I would like to start with the synopsis so that we can understand where we're coming from. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Devil on the Cross is an allegorical narrative that criticizes capitalism in Kenya in particular and Africa in general. Many things had happened before the narrative started. And of course, the story is based on a young woman. Her name is Jacinta Waringa. At the time the narrative begins, she's at the crossroad because she had lost her job, because she has refused to give in to her boss's sexual appeals. On returning back to her house, she finds her load outside, and apparently the landlord has thrown her out, and her boyfriend dumps her because she has lost her economic value. She was already suicidal, but she was saved by a stranger, and she decided to go back to her village, which is Ilmorog, an imaginary country created by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Now, on her way back to Ilmorog, that is where the crux of the story begins. Virtually every passenger in the bus that she boarded represents a social value in Kenya, in modern Kenya. And so by the time they get to the destination, the young woman Waringa had been impacted, especially by an elderly woman called Mary, who carried out an insurrection against a group of organized robbers and thieves in that imaginary town that was holding a meeting on how to defraud people. And now the synopsis of Murky Waters is written by a woman who was once the Director General of NAPTIP. And the story is a two-in-one narrative. The first narrative begins with a young Nigerian graduate lady, Kariebi, who finishes school and decided to go into journalism. She decides to relocate to the city where she can attend the college for journalism. And her auntie promises to get her accommodation at her friend's place. Kariebi gets to her auntie's friend's house and she became trapped. She was like someone, immediately she entered into that gate, she became immobile, not knowing that the woman is into human trafficking and sex slavery. That is how she joined a lot of other young women that were lured into that house, and they started servicing men, sometimes 12, 15 men in a day, irrespective of the time of the month it was for the ladies or their state of health or anything. All attempts to get the agent, the law enforcement agent to help them was met with different obstructions. Apparently the woman was bribing them until a tip-off happened and a special squad of policemen came and rescued Kariebi and the other young female victims. Now the second story begins where the agency now decided to use Kariebi and the other rescued victims as a bait to also capture the other traffickers who are yet to be captured so that they can be prosecuted. So this is the beginning of this paper. I would like to subsume my abstract into the overview and introduction. And I want to begin with saying that recognizing the fact that the African woman is the casualty of patriarchy and colonialism. From the time of the transatlantic slave trade, when the females who were shipped from Africa were positioned as people who took care of the chores and who also serviced the debts of their slave masters, up till when colonialism came around, the woman has been completely objectified. So this study attempts to reconstruct the woman, the image of the African woman who has been captured by the demon of sex exploitation by colonialism. Before colonialism, the African woman has a rightful place in the society. She was well respected. She was treasured. There was nothing like prostitution because every woman had a man, even if it meant a man having 6 women at a time. Every woman had a home, a man to herself. There was nothing like single mother. There was nothing like prostitution. In the African traditional societies, when one gets pregnant, she quickly informs her family and the family negotiates with the family of the man who gets her pregnant, and a marriage arrangement is contracted. Now, when colonialism came, the colonialists came in with the objectification of the woman as an appendage to the man to satisfy his sexual and fetishistic desires as a plaything. You know, the woman began to see herself as being only relevant for her commercial value. She became, the woman began to denote sexual fantasies. And so you find that that when colonialism came, instead of allowing the woman to remain where she was, which was an esteemed place, which meant that a woman had an opportunity to be married, colonialism came to debase the woman, first of all, with Christianity and the one man, one wife analogy. And so the men became tied to one woman, while the other women needed to be with a man to provide for them. And so that man could be a man in the wild. And that is how prostitution became ingrained in the African society. Now, this work is a treatise to ensuring that the African woman's femininity, which has been compromised by coloniality, is restored and preserved. Furthermore, coloniality ensured that the woman who used to have titles in her society, they were bestowed with titles. Many of them were leaders. They were even members of the leadership in their communities. They were recognized by their individual kings and clan leaders. These women were respected. They had names, you know. And then when you talk about the environment, you look at many of the oracles and deities had mediators who were women. In the Igbo traditional society, the earth, which is regarded as Ani, is the god of fertility. It represents fertility, truth, and justice. And the woman in the olden days used to be the mediator. And that particular deity is usually referred to with a feminine pronoun. Well, what happened with coloniality? Colonialism came and completely expunged the woman from leadership position, such that even warrant chief system, tax collection, tax masters, court clerks, and all the different administrative posts that were allowed for Africans, the women were not even elected to any of them. Both for the direct and the indirect rule, the women were nowhere to be found. And this is what has happened. The woman has been relegated to the background, and she has been made to see herself only based on her commercial value. And this is what Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in his latest nonfiction titled Wrestling with the Devil, the present memoir, calls the colonial affair. So the colonial affair made the woman, you know, it altered the economic and emotional realities of the African woman and conditions her to seek relevance and excellence, commercializing her body. Now, this paper employs two conceptual frameworks: decoloniality and human trafficking. Now, decoloniality is briefly known, seen as a positional approach that seeks to rediscover, revalidate, or restore indigenous knowledge, cultural values, and economic structures that has been suppressed in Africa by colonialism. And then the next conceptual framework is human trafficking, which refers to the recruitment, transportation, and transfer of humans in a deceptive manner with the aim of exploiting them for trafficking, for profit. And then when you talk about sex slavery, we are talking about a deliberate enslavement of an individual for sexual purposes. And then you come to the theoretical framework. This paper is looking at feminine, which is also called intersexuality, and individualist feminism. Now, intersectional feminism is a word that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 in her work. It refers to the various forms of inequality on social categories like race, like sexuality, ability, gender, which intersect or operates together or interacts with one another to result in the tension that the female gender is experiencing. And then when we talk about the individualist feminism, we are looking at, emphasizing on, a theory that is emphasizing on individual human rights. In fact, is an advocate for women's rights based on human rights to independence and trying to dismiss the relevance of natural differences between the two major sexes, and also to debunk the culturally and socially constructed gender roles, especially when we are talking about the issue of gender equality. And so this work raises a lot of questions. For instance, what is the conceptualization of sex slavery? There are a lot of women in very organized relationships, like marriages, like civil relationships, who are experiencing sex slavery. So what is exactly sex slavery? A lot of people don't even understand what it means to be in sex servitude. What are the occasions? What are the occasions that warrant it? What factors lead to it? Today, we look at Nollywood, we look at all these video vixens. When we go to clubs or when we go to all these social gatherings, and then there are women that are serving, how they dress, how they look. And so we apply it to the two books that we are looking at. Waringa had already had many sexual relationships. And you're talking about body counts. Today on social media, there are campaigns against women, judge her harshly by her body count. But this is the result of coloniality. A woman didn't have many body counts, didn't have any body counts at all. Women in those days were always married as virgins. And they were always, towards the period that they are going to be married, they are well decorated, their bodies are decorated with dyes, they are fed well. When they eventually marry a family, she's being served food, she's being given food, her husband meets with her for the first time, she consummates her marriage, and the husband returns a blood-stained white garment, a white cloth, meaning that she's a virgin, and she has her pride of place. Today, these things don't happen because of colonial. And this is the same fate that Waringa and B faces. Karebi decided for her life, but then somebody else who believes she can use her to make money has another plan for her. Although Karebi is innocent of whatever that happened, but unfortunately her body can.
Hello, please, can you round up?
And so we are looking at women in the society we have today, willingly and unwillingly getting trapped under sex slavery as initiated by colonialism. And so the conclusion is that her image can be redeemed, it can be reconstructed, to that original perspective that her traditional society established her from the onset. And this can be done through decoloniality. And we believe that the woman is capable of doing this for herself. She doesn't have for the government to do it. She just has to sit up one day like Waringa did in Ngugi's work when she made up her mind and went back to school, was trained and became an engineer, while somebody like Karebi also moved on with her life and trained to be a very recognized journalist, despite their past. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so we can continue with our questions now. Are there questions, comments from the audience? Okay. No. It's just two of them. Yeah, the last person.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. I just want to speak on, like, I understood during the course of your presentation, I understood the whole thrust of your presentation. And I want to ask, because if you want to decolonize African institutions about their over-reliance on the global south for their support now, how do you want them to come in such a way that, most especially as related to the funds, since most government and most even non-government organizations do not really support African institutions compared to what is obtainable in Europe and other North American universities. How do you want to bridge that particular gap? Okay, funding. For instance, now the Nigerian government now is actually withdrawing the support totally from supporting Nigerian university by the announcement of the loan scheme and all stuff, other things like that. How do you want to bridge that particular gap, sir?
All right. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Good evening to everyone. My name is Emmanuel Ofuasia, National Open University of Nigeria. Specifically, I have some questions and suggestions to the first presenter, Apogo from University of Zululand. I want to ask, to what extent is your project in University of Zululand committed to the use of logic in the process of decolonization? Secondly, I want you to consider in your project going forward, the tension between language and logic. Because if you take a look at some historical scholars in the West, for instance, Susan Stebbing, she says that whoever wants to master the history of Western philosophy must first of all be abreast with Aristotle's logic. Now we are writing in a language that is immersed heavily in this logic. And if we have to decolonize, should we continue with that logic? How do you consider that in your project going forward? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Decolonizing the westernized university. It tends in the direction I observed earlier, that is creating authenticity and destroying inauthenticity. But I see something that maybe if I use the word complement, I think what is, I say, I don't know, compliment will not be the right word. Let me say, make some correction. Okay. Yeah, I wanted to be polite, you know, but let me say it. Now, you see, the colonial rule, if not completely dead, are very nearly dead. Globalization is what's operating now. And globalization has different essence, meaning, values, vis-a-vis colonization, if you look at it. Even the Europeans, when they gathered their researchers to work on globalization, they concluded that globalization is the Americanization of their culture. That was what they came up with, you know, under that work. So I think your title should look more about what globalization is doing and not what colonization is doing. And in respect to that, if you talk about the thought was part of your title. Yeah, and I will say the problem is inauthentic thoughts. Our thoughts are inauthentic. The last lady showed it, and I'm going to get to that. Fine. So, well, you see, I am battling between being polite in my language and going straight to my point. Yeah, I like to be polite. That's the battle I'm going through. Yeah. So anyway, let me put it this way: that what I think is basic now is we have to have a sense of competition. I do not see a sense of competition in the universities. When you have a sense of competition, you have your own strategy for competing. Talking about borrowing and depending on that will not come in if you have a sense of competition. So if we want to get a university that's really authentic, competition has to come first. Nationalism has to come. let me end there. There are a lot of things. You know, it's an interesting one we'll discuss later. And then to the other one, the migration. I would think the focus is on migration. But what does he do about migration? I didn't hear her interrogation, whether she's for or against migration. I didn't quite get it. In other words, their aim, I didn't get it. If you go back, migration is a strategy. Getting people to the US, to the UK, because we're facing population implosion. Population inflation is the opposite of explosion. They were having less number of people, aging population, they call it. They were getting more older people than younger people. And they needed people to keep their machines going, the industry is going. So they worked out this strategy with IMF and World Bank to drive people back. If you get the book, LF Robergy, The Cost of Abortion, I think it's only like 5 pages. A book that really condenses it. So some people say, look at how much they are bringing back to Nigeria to that. And I say, think of what the economy would be like if we didn't go there to produce. We would have excelled them. So that's that. Then on the final paper, I think the woman went between feminism and, you know, her opening statement was more of feminism. And then when she went on, she said something that seemed to contradict that feminist view, because she said women, African women are the first casualty of patriarchy. Feminists hold that their problem is patriarchy. The patriarchy is oppressive to the agenda. That's the core issue in feminism. That is absolutely wrong. Why? Even in her statement, she now said that before colonization, women had their place. If they had their place, did you have patriarchy? If they had their place and have patriarchy, that suggests that patriarchy is not the problem. So what you have to do is, rethink the nature, purpose, and value of a woman, and see that feminism is completely wrong. And stop using the language of feminists and discussing direction of feminism. That's wrong. And finally, I think, is that the final paper? Yeah. Okay. So briefly, that's sort of my contribution.
All right, thank you very much, all the presenters. My question is for the very first presenter, my dear brother. I said jokingly that I'm going to sit at the feet of the decolonial masters themselves and learn. And I was not disappointed in any way. One of the things you said, and I say why you asked me to discard democracy. I can see you talking about how is it that there's need for us to promote Afrocentric grammars and vocabularies. I see that. Now, but my question has to do with Olufemi Taiwo's criticism of decolonialism. I think at some point he says this whole movement is actually depriving Africa of its agency. I want to see how you respond to that. But the other question I have is the whole idea of the whole project of privileging epistemologies of the global south. That raises a question in my mind as to what exactly ought to be the relationship between epistemologies of the south and the universalist epistemology we're trying to decenter. Should it be that we're trying to replace one hegemony with another? No, thank you. That's my question.
Please allow me just one thing. I want the last speaker to tell me the relationship between what that one now? Decoloniality and colonialism. I wanted to make this something coloniality and colonialism. Is colonialism a function of coloniality a function of colonialism, or is it a causal relationship? I want to have to know understand.
It's a question of the line.
Yes. Okay. We will come online very shortly. I have some questions for Ifeoma. I tried to follow her train of thought, and I could see the alignment with a number of scholarly works in African feminism. My challenge when we talk about pre-colonial African feminism is how we try to tie the agency of the woman to the man. So from what you have said, you give birth to a baby girl, you begin to nurture her, keep her a virgin, so that her husband will come out with a white handkerchief on her wedding night to show that she was chaste before she got married. I cannot imagine a more objectifying process of upbringing than that. You were essentially preparing her to go and be a good wife to somebody. And I think that that is what sums up patriarchy for me in pre-colonial African society. So when we talk about pre-colonial African society not discriminating against women, and yet we say on the other hand that women were free, and the sign that they were free was that they all had their men. The question then becomes, so were those women in those African societies that didn't want to have men outcasts or outliers? In other words, what kind of social acceptance did they have? Did people see them as abnormal? Why must you have a man as a woman for your agency to become salient in terms of what your gender identity is? So I think that is one area I believe you need to focus on. Then the other part of it that I also find a bit interesting is the attempt to link prostitution to patriarchy, especially in Africa. The whole idea that African societies didn't have prostitutes, and then colonialism brought prostitution, and then prostitution, took away the agency of African women. Well, I will say that there are contending scholarly works that actually identify prostitution when done willfully as an expression of female agency. People can choose to be prostitutes. And I agree totally with the angle on slavery, but I will also think that a monocausal account of sexual slavery may not adequately, paint the whole picture of what goes on in that particular industry if we do not interrogate it very well. Because even in Europe, we see people who traffic in women for the sole purpose of selling them, for the sole purpose of commodifying them. Matter of fact, there are women who run prostitution rings. So I am looking at, is there an economic dimension to this beyond the ideological, beyond what we can call the patriarchal exploitation of minors or victims of sexual trafficking? So in order not to take too much time, we will take the question online, and then we'll begin to have responses from our presenters. You need to read. Okay. Let's see. Who is asking questions online? Oh. Okay, please, can we have your question?
Yes, good afternoon. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, my name is Bukola. All right, thank you so much. I have a question for Ifeoma Onwugbufo. That was the last presenter, and she spoke about sex slavery, colonialism, feminism, and would like her to shed more light on the relationship between feminism itself, colonialism, and how it relates to sexual slavery. Also, I would like to know if she has considered the role of economic empowerment and independence, which is largely one of the reasons for migration in the first place, which is to find in itself, because people want to travel, they want to seek greener pastures, and somehow they fall into the hands of these traffickers, which eventually leads to the sexual slavery that you're talking about. And also, have you considered the area of willful fusion by women? There are women who actually go into prostitution, not necessarily because somebody pushed them to it, but because they have a motive for wanting to either financial, whatever it is. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So one more question that I will add for Ifeoma, because she said you can bring this to an end by just being strong-willed. But if patriarchy is an institution of inequality, the question is, how do we dismantle it by just being strong-willed? Are there no institutional needs, requirements that we need to actually accomplish this? So we'll have one more question from the audience, and our presenters have the floor.
Okay, good evening. Dr. Ifeoma, I would like to say that was a lovely presentation, but I would also like to make one or two contributions to guide your work. I think one of the reasons why we are having so much response from everybody about your presentation is because perhaps maybe it's because of the presentation and not because you have seen the whole work, but it will also help us if you could look at the history of feminism in Africa. Because at every stage, there must have been a reason why feminism arose in Africa. And it is not, and let us also not make the mistake that African feminism is the same as Western feminism. They are quite different, because the realities we are, or the realities that are being, that is the focus, are quite different. So if you can have that at the back of your mind, I think it will help you in jumping over these loopholes that one will fall into in your work. Okay, that's just what I would like to say, because the issue of white handkerchief is it's already an expression of patriarchy in colonial Africa. So, but there must have been a reason why feminism developed in Africa to answer all this. So maybe you should just consider the history of feminism in Africa, and also vis-a-vis the history of Western feminism. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start. Appreciate life management.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you for listening, even being here till this time. So let me try to shoot fast. So you asked, why focus on Africa alone? To be modest, one university is huge. You don't have the strength. I mean, if you let me say this, it's colonial people who want to solve the whole world's problems. We don't want to impose ideas on the whole world. We want to do what we can do. I've been working in that university for 7 years. I'm an African, there are positional issues. It's something we can handle. We are not even sure we can do it completely. So like we're here begging for correction, for information. So I really don't know who can now take on all the universities in the world. I don't know if anybody does it. I will join their church. Then the issue of virtue, maybe we shouldn't have put that. But what it meant was it only signified deficiencies in the current university institution vis-a-vis its role in society. You know the idea of the ivory tower, the aloof institution that appears to be superior to the society around it. There's a dimension of our work that I didn't have, there's not time to mention in a short presentation of this nature, is working with the community, seeing the community as stores of knowledge, not unlike the colonial idea, which sees the community as a place for data collection. We collect data from the university, we take it to the seminar room, we bring our theories from America, and we describe their life. It's something we are working against, contrary to the community And that's one of the things I've enjoyed in this conference, hearing about the shoulder and some of all these things that we never knew, that this information comes from the community. We need to relate with our immediate communities and learn from them. Let's not forget that indigenous societies survived for thousands of years before colonization, and they thrived. They thrived. There was a street light in Benin before there was a street light in Europe. Yeah, that is a fact. It's a European historian. It's a European historian that we got it from. He came from Netherlands and came to Benin and said the street arrangement is better than in Europe. So we are talking about our residues. So we are interested, like we in the University of Zululand, we are situated within the Zulu culture. So we are interested in tapping. We are not coming to Benin or Yoruba land. We are interested in what we can get from that Zulu community. So that's one. Professor Simi asked the questions. You said African epistemologists. We believe they are multiple. We do not assume that they are necessarily similar. The point of similarity would be the common experience of colonization and maybe climatary experiences and coloniality. So that's we've not for once assumed things to be similar. We are not trying to take things like that. We know there's a lot to learn that we do not know, and we are open to all that knowledge. Yes, your question is a very opposite one. How do we deal? So that's a challenge. If I say I know how to deal with it now, I won't be saying the truth. But I'll tell you something. The South African government is doing far better than most governments in Nigeria in terms of funding universities. But then they are also following the neoliberal line, which is to give up the university to the financial hawks, which is a problem. So part of our strategy is to build an ecology of supporters, of people who, there's a lot of uptake on the idea of decolonization of education. Some of these people have money. Some of the institutions and the individuals who are interested in Africa breaking free from dependence on the North, they have money. And we are looking to those sources if possible. So that's to answer that question quickly. Now, Emmanuel, your question is very opposite. The tension between language and logic, how language bears logic. Yes, one of the goals of any process of decolonizing education is a withdrawal, a systematic withdrawal, or a withdrawal of complete reliance on the colonial language. So we also have to develop our local languages. So we are also doing work in that. So we recognize that. We recognize the problem of colonial logics, which reside in colonial narratives and colonial languages. Take the term informal, for instance. People don't know how violent that terminology is. The vast majority of non-European people are considered informal. To be informal means you do not qualify for support. You are not to be taken seriously. The informal is a signifier of absence. It means you are not serious, you are not important, you do not deserve respect. So we understand that and we pay attention to that in what we do. For instance, that is why, for instance, we'll be interested in, for instance, we are thinking of bringing people from the communities to do presentations. We only bring professors to do presentations. Why don't we bring these babalawos yes, why don't we bring a babalawo? We are here debating about a Osho Odaran. Why don't we bring a babalawo who has learned that thing in generations? Why don't we bring him here to do a presentation? Because he doesn't have PhD. So these are some of the things we need to rethink. I like your question whether we are going to reproduce a new hegemony. We are extremely sensitive to that, and I did say it in the abstract. So when we say we are non-fundamentalists, that's what we mean. We do not say that African thoughts, African knowledges are total. We are not saying they are all-encompassing. We do not say they are intrinsically superior, even. What we are saying rather is that African ideas would work for Africans. We are saying using your own ideas, you know yourself, you know your history. You have your grandmother, your great-grandmother, you have your babalawo. You have those people he mentioned to tell you about your history. If you learn that, you learn pride. You learn self-reliance, and then you will solve your own problems. Because the man coming from abroad, take this notion of foreign direct investment. It's crap. Permit my language. It's bullshit. Nobody comes from overseas to make you rich. USC was foreign direct investment. The Royal Niger Company was foreign direct investment. It is meant to exploit. And for Africans to be taught that we need foreign direct investment to grow, they are cementing our slavery forever. So those are the kinds of ideas we are talking about. A sense of competition, I agree with you, sir, that our universities need to see themselves as aspiring towards excellence and work to do. I agree with you 100%. Then when we say inauthentic thought, what we mean by African thought is that focus, African-centered, not discarding non-African information. No. We don't discard it. If you give me an idea from Scandinavia that will solve the power problem in Nigeria, I'll grab it with both hands. But we must be focused on ourselves. So for instance, we're in Nigeria, we have first semester, second semester, right? In South Africa, they have winter semester and the summer semester. In America, they have fall semester. Are we now going to have fall semester in Nigeria? No. Do we even know what fall is? And so that's what we mean by African thought. Thinking, ideas, innovation that is focused on solving our own problems. I hope that answers the questions. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Another question.
Thank you very much. We will go to.
Okay, sorry, there's one important question. The response to time. Yeah. I wanted to start this presentation to say that it's because of decolonization we are here. Taiwan is too wrong. He's too wrong in what he's saying. I don't want to use an impolite term for him. The reason we are seated here right now, the reason you have a PhD in the University of Lagos is because of decolonization. Because there was a time nobody will allow you to study a PhD. Taiwan will not be in America if it was not decolonization. So we are carrying on from where the former people stopped. To now say we should not, there's a Yoruba saying I learned from Prof. Bewaji. If there is lice in your blood, in your body, if the lice is still in your body, blood will not depart from your finger. Yes. So we are in this situation and we are saying that decolonization is unnecessary because they confuse globalization and modernism. They fail to understand that contemporary globalization and Euro-modernism are factors of colonization and coloniality. Mind you, the globalization we see today is not the first phase of globalism. Globalization has been happening for decades. This is just one branch of globalization in which Euro-modernists are dominant. It doesn't mean it's the only form of globalization. Yes. No, yes. People went overseas before colonialism. I mean, what is globalization? They had intercontinental interaction before globalization, before colonialism, before the 1700s. So there have been waves of globalization, but this wave, we agree, is dominated by this racialized capitalist system of Euro-modernism. But to now say that is different from colonialism and coloniality is a mistake.
The globality exists before colonialism.
Thank you. We need our.
We'll carry on that conversation.
We need to hear from our other contributors. Please, do you have responses for the question?
Yes, thank you for a very interesting session. The first thing about what is decolonial about our study. So we said very clearly that we're coming as Global South scholars to enter into a knowledge creation sphere. And I think that, I mean, there's so many dimensions through which you can view this decoloniality and decolonization, but it doesn't always have to be that you have to conflict before you can do it. There's of course this contrast between what we already know and where we're trying to go. And as I said, the approach we used is to question the assumptions that had already been taken for granted. And that alone in itself is one, allowing global scholars to do something that they were not, Global South scholars to do something that they were not allowed to do in the first place. we're not saying that we're so immersed in this decolonial. We wrote our study, as I said to you, from a reflexive perspective, and it's mostly reflexivity more than it is decoloniality. But it is permitting Global South scholars to think outside the spheres that were created before and to think about how they can contribute to knowledge creation and not be just consumers of this knowledge. The next question had to do with experiences of people coming into Nigeria. And I think it resulted from my rushing my last slide. I did not in any way suggest that there was no immigration into Nigeria, even though Nigeria was a net sending country. What we said was that the focus, and not just for Nigeria, for many net sending countries, always what happens when there's emigration. And our study specifically focused on immigration. And why I made that comment is it was some of our findings when we questioned people in our semi-structured interviews about what they thought the contributions of immigrants were. The answers seemed a bit about them not having considered this very seriously before now. And the whole, I'm not against or for migration, we're scholars, we're never against, I mean, I'm not an activist for any position at all, we're scholars. But what I want to say is that both parts are important, and that if we want to think about migration as a whole, then we need to consider, immigration and emigration, and particularly for Nigeria as a net receiving country in Africa. So while we are net sending to the rest of, to the whole globe, we are net receiving within Africa. Other Africans tend to come here. We need to think about how we want to view that. There's so much we can say about this, but I'll leave space for another speaker. Thanks so much for interesting contributions.
Thank you. Thank you. So we go to our last presenter. If you have quick responses in 3-4 minutes.
I hope I can do this in 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of observations. But let me start with the last speaker who suggested that I go research into the history of feminism some more in Africa. And I'll do that. So thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate your suggestion. Now, let me go to the very first speaker who said that he needed to understand the difference or the relationship between decoloniality and colonialism. While I was making my presentation, there won't be any need for me to repeat because of lack of time, but I remember that I was able to define, the paper was able to define decoloniality. And if you look at colonialism is something that came and destabilized our values, our economic and political structures, and everything that made us Africans, which was working for us. And so decoloniality is the process of undoing and restoring, undoing what colonialism had done to our values, and then revalidating those structures. Now, when it comes to feminism, people, especially women, are very sensitive about it. But I will try to address one or two things here. I think it was Adeolu that talked about, what about people who personally decide to be prostitutes? Let me also remind us that the two literary texts that were reviewed in this work they were not showcasing women who chose prostitution as a career. They were not showcasing women who intentionally wanted to be trafficked in order to make money. They were showing women who were ready to work with their own hands. Karibi was deceived into trafficking. And this is the fate of many people who go through this trafficking. We keep looking at the people who succeeded. There are so many that it never favored. Somebody like Karibi in the second literary text has been, for all the months she was there, having sex with more than 15 men, she was not paid a dime. She was not paid a dime. Some of these texts you will need to read. These are people's experiences. During their periods, they stuff them with toilet roll and cotton wool, and men still go in there. This is not something anybody is going to say, oh, there are people who chose it. Yes, if I have an elder sister who is a pimp or who is a trafficker, and she decides to do it for me successfully, I cannot come and say, okay, because my own worked, there are no other women who ran into the wrong hands, who were, some of them were even taken through, through oaths, that they will not live 5 years. There are terrible discussions. The lady that wrote this, she organized a symposium, and I attended it. And she showed a video of people live who were confessing the terrible experiences they had with human trafficking and sex slavery, and even prostitution. I don't think there is anybody that wakes up in the morning and say, me, I don't want to live a straight life. I want to be a prostitute all my life. Everybody, even though we say, yes, some people, but who wants to marry a prostitute? I mean, who wants to be associated with one? Who can come and see me now and say, please meet Ngozi, my younger sister. She's a prostitute. Nobody will like to introduce anybody like that. This is my best friend, Nkechi. She's a prostitute. So people talk about feminism and they go against these things as if it is something to be proud of. Nobody, I have never met anybody who introduced any of his sisters or friends to me and tells me a prostitute. Nobody has done that. Now, when we are talking about patriarchy, yes, feminism is something that kicks against patriarchy. But I am talking from my own perspective. I am from Ogidi, from Chinua Achebe's place. Where I come from, the man is the head of the family, but the woman has a say. Where I come from, before colonialism, women were taking, what do you call it? Women were taking titles. Women were even acting as mothers of masquerades. We call it Nnemang. That is the mother of masquerades. And they will tell you that woman is also near a masquerade. But in my place, a woman can actually be initiated into that cult. So I don't know how patriarchy works in so many other societies, but I know that in my society, yes, the man was in charge, but the woman also had, a right of place. Now, when we talk about, when I suggested strong will for women, sometimes, most of the time, women go into prostitution because of hardship. A lot of time, I went through so many researches. People interview prostitutes, what has happened. I have also lodged mistakenly in hotels where there are more prostitutes lodging there, and you have discussions with these ladies. One of them, I've never come across a prostitute that told me, I chose it as a career. That's what I want to be in my life. Most of the prostitutes are pushed by certain situations in their capacity. As I say that, we keep forgetting that I have two literary texts that I'm looking at. And then the paper is talking about the two women that are there. One of them, the Kenyan lady, she reconnected with her real life.
Please round up in a minute. We are 5 minutes behind time.
Okay. And then, yes, when we are talking about feminism, we are also talking about decency. Feminism does not encourage indecent living. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. We want to thank all our presenters, and we thank the LSA for this opportunity. See you all next year. Thank you.
For having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.